Welcome, guys. I've talked to you many times over the course of, I don't know, years about this topic, actually. So let's start off with a big question, and that is, how many people are going to end up being on GLP-1s or obesity drugs? It feels like at this point in time, everybody knows at least one person, if not two, if not three, who are taking these drugs. What's your perspective on that?
It's an interesting group to do a market size exercise with. I think there's a few ways to look at it, top down, bottom up, and then a few other analogous data points to help triangulate it. When you think about bottoms up, right now there's probably about 8 million people in the US. We could start with the US and then people can extrapolate. Pharma revenue is usually about 50% US, 50% elsewhere, even though we're only 6% of the population. So bottoms up, you probably have about 8 million people on GLP-1s right now. About 6 million that are on it for diabetes, about 2 million for weight loss. That's excluding compounding. If you want to add compounding, which the data is a little bit less certain there, you'd probably add another about 2 million. So if that grows 25% per year over 5 years, you're going to see 25 to 30 million people in the US. You can maybe 3 or 4x it internationally. Top down in the US, you probably have about 160 million US adults that are eligible for it, maybe another 10 million kids. And then in terms of other blockbuster drugs and other categories, you see probably about 40 million people on statins. You'll see maybe 40 to 60 million people on drugs for hypertension in the US, maybe 200 million internationally. So I think that it's at that level, if not greater, in the next 5 years.
What do you think are going to be the main drivers of adoption? And Scott, I'm just curious, is it going to be form factor, when orals come onto the market, when it's not once a week, it's less frequent? Is it more indications? What are going to be the biggest drivers?
Yeah, look, I think all those things. I think getting more product variety on the market, including orals, longer-acting injectables, different formulations that maybe drive different levels of weight loss. We talked about the amylin-only compounds, which look like they're going to potentiate less weight loss, but could potentially be more tolerable than the GLP-1s or the dual-acting injectable agents. And so I think as you get more product variety on the market, that allows people to match drugs to their individual needs as well as their individual desires in terms of convenience and delivery and frequency. That's going to broaden opportunities. To me, the debate early on, and I had this discussion with regulators, was, are the distributed benefits that we're seeing, and this conversation started after the SELECT trial, where you saw that dramatic reduction in cardiovascular risk in patients who were already optimally treated on an existing therapeutic armamentarium. And the debate that was going on was, is this being driven purely by the weight loss, or are there other benefits that these drugs are having, reducing metabolic imprinting, having distributed metabolic impacts that we're not fully able to measure? And most people, I think, inside the FDA and inside scientific circles felt that the benefits were being driven entirely by the weight reduction. I think as we've seen more distributed benefits, as the SELECT data has matured and the magnitude of the benefit looks to be stronger and more durable, I think that there is a gradual shift in views in the medical community and the scientific community that maybe these drugs are having a benefit apart from just the weight reduction. And if that thesis gets solidified, I think this is going to become something that far more people want to be on, because it's providing some kind of distributed metabolic effect. And to step back on that, there is a lot of metabolic imprinting from adipose tissue. So after you gain a certain amount of weight, you do reset your metabolic system in some deleterious ways. And so being able to reduce that is going to probably have some kind of distributed effect on your overall metabolic health.
Yeah, obviously the more indications are going to be one reason why many people want to take it. A big driver in this whole adaptation of GLP-1s, Rick, has been technology. And I can't think back, and Scott, maybe you can chime in on this later, to a drug where people were so in tune to the brand name and requesting it, since maybe Viagra.
Yeah.
Maybe similar audience.
The biggest drug since Viagra. Yes.
You're an investor in Roche 7 years ago, and this has been a big driver. You've seen that.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things coming together. So it's the branding of the drug. Obviously, people want to look good, feel better. So it's something people really want and need, no different than Viagra. But then it's also access. And it's companies like Ro being able to provide access at the right times. And it's, Ro has the insurance checker. So you can see if you're covered by insurance. You're also able to have updates. If you have side effects, being able to tell a virtual assistant that's in your pocket, in your phone, how things are going. You're able to have better indications of, is this correct or not? especially if you're paying for part of it out of pocket. So your ability to have a doctor in your pocket with Ro being your guide through this change is incredibly important. So you're aware of it, you know it, you see it, it's in the news, it's on CNBC, but also you're taken care of through the process better, and you have better access. So all these three megatrends are kind of coming together to really create the blockbuster.
For you, how has that changed your business? You started with erectile dysfunction, so like a Viagra, hair loss. You switched to these weight loss drugs. These are all drugs that people seek. So how do you see the growth trajectory going forward, especially as, you know, maybe we're reaching a point where this is it for insurance for obesity, other indications will change that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the thing that's very unique about GLP-1s is it satisfies 5 criteria that people have never before seen in medicine, right? So the majority of the US population is eligible for it. It's scalable, it's effective, providers want patients to have it, and patients want it. And so that dynamic creates that tremendous pull. For us, we're not hitting a ceiling as it relates to patients with obesity or patients with overweight. It's 75% of the US population. I think what Scott was talking about on the pricing aspect is that's where, as indications, as the breadth of the label increases, that's where you'll see coverage increase. But you talked about, hey, what are some of the other, I think, non-obvious things that are gonna drive down price? One of the ones that I don't think people are talking enough about actually is you have a lot of pharma companies working on these products, and they're actually posting quite similar results. And so you'll see, and people are excited by that, of course, but when 10 or 15 companies post weight loss results or efficacy results that are quite similar, it's gonna be very, very difficult for that to not be commoditized quickly, right? We're unimpressed now with 22% weight loss from CagriSema. You saw Novo lost 20% of its stock price. And so from a patient's perspective, you're actually rooting for the next like 5, 10 people to just have Me Too products, because if they spend hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars on supply, on research, it's gonna drive down that price. The second thing I think you'll see drive down that price, and it might be counterintuitive, and we were talking about this off stage a little bit, is the slower that coverage increases, the faster that those list prices, but also the consumer cash pay prices will come down, right? If pharma knew tomorrow that whatever amount of coverage was fixed today, they would know that the majority of the US population to get this drug has to pay for it. And as a result, you'd see the price come down. And you see that happen in other countries when it either isn't covered yet by their single payer system, or just the pharma company has entered there and there's not enough for it. You just see that price be 1/5 what it is in the US.
It's interesting you mentioned the smaller companies that come out with the 20% weight loss, and we barely look at that because it's just completely unimpressive. Those drugs probably will never come to market. I mean, the bar has been reset, where you need to sort of break through in order for those billions of dollars to be spent on manufacturing and going to the phase 2 and the phase 3 to actually get it across the finish line. You need to have the bar, cross the bar in a very firm and definite way. So Scott, what's your take on this notion that, if all these drugs came, it would lower the price? These drugs will probably never come, which would cement the monopoly or the duopoly that Lilly and Novo have.
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think a drug that achieves less weight loss but has other convenience factors, there's going to be a market for that. And I mentioned the amylin drugs, which seem to be very tolerable, 15% weight reduction, maybe on the high end, but for a lot of consumers, that's more than enough. And the drug seems to be very easy to come onto. So I think it's going to be a market for people who try GLP-1s and they can't tolerate them, but also a de novo market for people who don't want 25% weight reduction. And you mentioned an interesting thing about CagriSema, where there was a 23% rate reduction. Novo sold off because people were expecting 25% rate reduction. In that trial, a lot of patients didn't hit the higher dose, and that's why the overall weight reduction was down. So the question is, did they not hit the higher dose because they were having side effects and so they couldn't dose up? Or did they not hit the higher dose because once they lost 20% of their weight, that was good enough? And I think that may be an element of that. So I'm not sure everyone's chasing 25% weight reduction. There's going to be consumers that have different desires, and they may migrate to different kinds of drugs. And I think the market could get bifurcated along how much you want to achieve. This isn't like statins, where the lower you go with your cholesterol, the better. So everyone wanted the high-dose statin. I think this is going to be a much more titrated market, and platforms like you are going to be able to go to patients with this suite of offerings and match a product to a patient based on what they're looking for.
And we take on that complexity right now. If a patient comes in, right, and they'll see, they'll be able to balance the cost of that product, the efficacy, whether or not their insurance covers it, what their copay might be. And they are, in a consumer-driven marketplace, people are naturally trading off between cost, quality, and convenience. And so the wider array of products you have, you can help people highlight what might be best for them, and then they obviously also might switch in between products as their journey changes too.
Right.
No, I think so. You're going to be the product management for that. That if you don't like needles, if you want to take it once a month, whatever that is, you're going to have your personalized healthcare journey.
And there are also, of course, other things to weigh, not just convenience in terms of how many times a week or how many times a month and the side effects, but also, muscle loss, muscle mass loss, and things like that. What are some of the most interesting sort of developments in this space, in your view, in terms of drugs to come onto the market? What sort of variations of the drug interest you?
Yeah, I think Scott can probably talk better about sort of the upcoming pipeline in terms of the worries around lean muscle mass and what we're trying to do to combat that. I also think with anything, there is I think it's a little bit overstated because all of the trials, you're seeing an improvement in functional performance from the individual. So people who naturally carry excess weight, they also carry excess muscle. You don't want them, it's more worrisome in an older age, right? We don't want someone with, in their older age where they might have trouble putting on muscle mass. So I think the most interesting thing, and we saw it in the clip that I see as it relates to downstream from GLP-1s, is the cascading ripple effect of them, right? So, and we saw the clip here, but it was during our interview where we talk a lot about internally at Ro, GLP-1 serving as this jetpack for positive behavior change, right? And so when people lose a little bit of weight, they're able to sleep a little bit better, so they exercise more, and then that's just this virtuous flywheel happens. We also see they eat more poultry, more fish, more vegetables. They eat less confectionaries. They eat less, they drink less, all of these different things. And then you think, so that's their consumption behavior. Then their lifestyle also changes. They exercise more, they buy more lingerie, they date more, all of these, they travel more, all these different things happen. They spend less on groceries. So there's this incredible, we're not seeing it yet. People, I think, classic, overestimate what happens in a year, underestimate 10. So I don't think Walmart's gonna see suddenly people buy fewer Oreos. But when 50 million people are on this drug, like if statins had the effect on consumption behavior and lifestyle behavior that we think GLP-1s will, it'll naturally shift given how much of our society is driven by our desire to consume. What are the cascading ripple effects? It'll be quite fascinating to watch.
Well, statins led to an overconsumption of French fries.
There you go.
They eat high cholesterol food.
Pendulum.
So yeah.
But I've asked you in the past, Scott, the GLP-1s will be the biggest drug since, and you said statins.
I think
Will they be bigger?
I think probably not, because there's still a little bit of an inconvenience factor getting on the drugs. There's still some friction and staying on the drugs. The statin's easy to get on, easy to stay on. But I think that they could push those kinds of levels if you look at just the overall morbidity in the population, the health benefits that we're seeing from these drugs. I agree with you. I think a lot of the emerging data is that the muscle loss is attributed to the weight reduction, and people who lose a lot of weight need to compensate. They should be doing resistance training. Obviously, there's companies that are looking at layering into these drugs compounds that would try to build back some of that muscle. Lilly has a compound they licensed from Novartis that was being tested in inclusion body myositis, a disease, a muscle wasting disease. So we'll see if that kind of innovation comes to market and whether it's able to compensate for the small reductions in muscle tone that we see, smooth muscle. But I think, it's skeletal muscle, excuse me, but I think that, I think a lot of this is directly attributed to the weight reduction and the rapid weight reduction that you achieve with these drugs.
Right. You invested in Ro 7 years ago.
Yes.
Back when it was ED, hair loss, early days. Now it's huge. GLP-1s, it's a huge player in this business. What has that done for the business, in your view, Rick? And it's also created a whole cottage industry of telehealth companies who are also offering compounded drugs, access to GLP-1s. How is the competition shaped up, and how does Ro stand out?
So when we invested, we really believed in two things. We believed that direct-to-consumer healthcare was going to be important, and that had to be centered around a patient. So having the right mindset to do that made a lot of sense, and then a great team. And putting a big market and a great team together creates great companies. And we've seen that a number of times in the past. As this market's evolved, it's probably come on faster than anyone could have expected. And anytime anything comes on faster than you've expected, you get bad players, good players in the market, white hats, gray hats, black hats. And I think the most important thing is being able to say, hey, we're continuing to be the white hat player. There's a million ways that you can see in any business where people could get grabby for incremental profits. But making sure, especially in healthcare, that you stay above the fray, you make sure you put the patient first, that's your North Star, and do the right thing is going to be the important thing in the long run, because whether it's regulatory environment or other reasons, this market's going to shake out and there's going to be tremendous winners who've done the right thing the whole time.
Mm-hmm. The regulatory environment has not really been there, and I say that sort of reluctantly, when it comes to monitoring this cottage industry of telehealth companies, not talking about players like Ro, but other players who are just offering some sort of compounded, the barrier to entry in terms of a consumer getting their hands on a compounded GLP-1 are extremely low. I mean, as part of my documentary, I went on to a site and I told them a fake BMI and they're like, oh, where can we send it to you? You know, is that easy? So Scott, in your view, what needs to be done and what do you think will be done, if anything? Obviously, they're looking into whether or not these drugs are, qualified to be compounded now, and now, some are not. But what more needs to be done in your view?
Yeah, look, I think Ro's in a different position here because they've moved into an environment where they're very focused on being compliant vis-a-vis FDA regulations. They're partnering with Lilly. They're working with compounders that are operating within the regulatory framework. And so they have sort of set the model for how to do this right if you're a telehealth provider. But there are a lot of telehealth providers, to your point, that are selling 505A compounded products that haven't gone through any regulatory scheme, aren't even being supervised by state pharmacy boards and state regulators. And so there's a lot of buyer beware. This causes FDA a lot of discomfort because the rules around compounding were put in place following the tragedy at the New England Compounding Center in 2012, where 800 people got sick and 100 tragically died from a compounded product that was contaminated with a fungal contaminant, a steroid injection that was being injected into their spines ahead of surgery. So FDA has a lot of concerns about this. It's been hard for them traditionally to enforce in this space because a lot of these compounders operate at a state level. They have a lot of support from their local congressmen. A lot of these are in red states like Florida and Texas, and so those delegations are very active on the Hill trying to protect these businesses. And they see the FDA regulation as impeding their ability to kind of branch out and seek out more revenue opportunities, engage in things like stocking doctors' offices with compounded products that doctors say they need to have on hand to meet patient demand. So I think from a regulatory standpoint, FDA has clearly now for example, the shortage of tirzepatide is over. They will step into the market and start to try to sweep some of the existing compounders off the market. They'll probably go after the larger compounders first. This is going to be a long fight by the FDA, and the political environment right now for them, at least over the next 4 years, isn't great. I don't think they're going to get a lot of support from a Republican administration, Republican Congress to enforce in this space, because traditionally Republicans have been more supportive of the compounded pharmacies. Mm-hmm. So I think having kind of let this cat out of the bag, so to speak, I think they're going to have a hard time getting it back in. But they're going to try, and they're going to march through these compounders one by one. But I don't think being a scofflaw is a good place to be and a good place to build a business model. So I applaud what Ro's done, where they've really moved to create a much more, I think, legitimate platform.
Mm-hmm. How has that shaped demand for the product in general? When you have so many people who want it and can get access because they can afford the compounded version.
I think that is one of the most interesting, just from a research and study perspective, I think that is one of the most interesting things about this shortage, and GLP-1s in particular, is I think it has shed light on a lot of the tensions and flaws of our healthcare system and highlight just how challenging it can be. Right? Because you do have a situation where with insurance coverage, you do have about 50 million people in the US who are covered. And we've talked about this. When patients are quote unquote covered, 80% of them pay on average $50. So, and we just talked about there's 8 million people on the drug, but there's 50 million people who have coverage for about, let's say 40 million people who have coverage for about $50. So there's sort of infinite demand at current prices or current coverage prices. But what the shortage ended up highlighting is all of the systemic, we were talking about this a little bit off stage, it shed light on all this systemic and sort of incentive flaws of, okay, well, why does your employer get to say what you should be able to have access to? What is this bizarre list to net pricing that we hear about? It's $1,000, but the only people who pay $1,000 are the ones who don't have coverage. And so it highlighted that. We were talking about backstage, the Spider-Man meme of, you have a pharma company, you have a PBM, and you have an insurance company, and they're all pointing at each other saying, you're the reason why we have such high prices. What Scott and Rick mentioned, at least with our integration with Lilly, I think one of the most exciting things, and Rick invested 7 years ago, and I've been at Roe now for 8 years, and I think we dreamt of the idea very early on that if you could remove middlemen and you invested in technology, that you could fundamentally lower the cost of healthcare while increasing access. We often talk about, in order to limit our costs, we have to restrict access, but it's like blowing up a balloon and trying to push it at the same time. You can't really do that. The technology has always been one of the ways we've turned luxuries into commodities, right? And so I think that is what is fascinating about at least the integration here with Lilly, is that there were 2 companies in the announcement. We removed PBMs, we removed insurance companies, and suddenly, magic, the drug and the entire experience is half the price. So I think that is the shortage highlighted, and I think you've seen Pfizer do this with Pfizer for All. It highlighted that it is absolutely possible to go direct to consumer, to remove the middlemen, increase access while reducing costs. And I think right now you're seeing it. You needed a drug like GLP-1s to serve as that catalyst. Right. But I think 10 years from now, you will see the majority of healthcare, maybe not dollars, but interactions, happen in that environment that's sort of outside what we view as the traditional healthcare system.
It's a hard thing to do from a regulatory standpoint because FDA will view anything, you're partnered with Lilly now, so they're going to view anything you do on your platform as potentially being activity by Lilly to promote, and so they need your activities to be compliant with their with the promotional regulations that they're governed by, which are really restrictive. And so I think only certain platforms are able to operationalize this. You were able to do it. Pfizer, as you mentioned, where I'm on the board, has set up a direct-to-consumer offering, but the level of sort of regulatory compliance you need to be able to do that in a fashion that will satisfy the agency, it's a pretty high bar. So I think it's going to take more sophisticated players if you want to be partnered with a pharmaceutical company in rolling out these offerings.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is going to, we only have a couple minutes left, but I do want to get to, we were talking backstage about how there probably won't be any new drug releases in 2025, but there are a lot of studies going on in various phases. What is the most exciting one that you're watching for this year?
Dementia.
Dementia, the results in dementia. Yeah, I mean, then everybody can qualify for the drug.
Lilly's going to turn over a card on a trial in early onset dementia, and I think if that's positive, that's going to be a huge impetus for a lot more people to want to get on this drug.
I think we'll see in Q2 or Q3, we'll see Lilly's oral orforglipron. Mm-hmm. We'll see the results of that. People think that they'll see about 14.5%, 15% weight loss from an oral. It's much easier to take than the oral version of semaglutide, far greater efficacy, probably on par with Wegovy efficacy, but an oral, so small molecule, far easier to produce across the world. So I think that is something when we think about, hey, how do we potentially go from something being $1,000 or even $500 if you want the net, and also where it's limited to 8 million people to 100 million people or 200 or 1 billion, you're going to see that be a small molecule oral because pharma companies can stamp out those in infinite supply at pennies.
Have they said that it's going to cost less? Because when I interviewed the CEO of Novo Nordisk, and granted this was like a year and a half ago, I asked him, will orals be cheaper? He said, not necessarily.
Well, not their oral, right? Because they're looking at the high dose of Rybelsus, the 50 milligram dose, and I think they're limited by the active ingredient they can produce because the bioavailability of that drug, I think, is like less than 1% relative to the injectable. So the injectable is a 2 milligram product. This is a 50 milligram product to try to achieve similar efficacy. So I think that they must be constrained on their supply.
Well, just to double click on that, because I think that's one of the things that people underestimate. So the highest dose of Ozempic is 2.0, Wegovy it's 2.4, and that's once a week. Mm-hmm. And then you have the higher dose in the Oasis trial for semaglutide was 50 milligrams every day.
Yeah.
So
because it can't be absorbed, so they need to give a very high dose to achieve the same PK.
Yeah. So you need 145 times the amount of semaglutide to be able to scale the oral, which is different with orforglipron and the drug there.
How much bigger is Roe going to be in a year because of GLP-1s?
Well, I think the demand we're seeing is almost insatiable. If you add dementia, most people should be on it for a lot of different reasons, and therefore Roe will be much bigger.
There was even, the trial, I forget the exact patient population they enrolled, but it wasn't people with sort of advanced dementia. It was very early stage memory loss, which
Yes.
I think I can be confident in that.
I volunteer for it
Depending on the
too.
day.
I can't remember anything.
Well, thank you
13
guys for a
hours.
great conversation. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.